These are the sorts of characteristics that we understand to represent defensive routines. And in a person, defensive routines can be actions or behavior, but on a team or organizational level, defensive routines can also be represented by things like operating policy. And these act as substitutes for thinking and learning when confronting change. That's the exact reason why we as humans hate change, because we've established defensive routines, which mean our brains don't have to cope with high cognitive load when making decisions, and then we're confronted with change and suddenly we have to flip to our front conscious brain, and that's much more taxing. And we are programmed as animals to make the most efficient use of our energy as possible, and our brains use about 25% of all the calories we burn in any given day. So defensive routines are a good way of keeping that cognitive load down. In organizations, defensive routines can often be tried and tested methods that appear to be rational and realistic, and they can be responsible for or associated with success in the past. That can be framed positively or negatively, but you might remember in the Columbia disaster case study, one of the explanations for the fact that they didn't want to take any drastic action in relation to the accident that had occurred on liftoff of the space shuttle was that these things have never led to a fatal incident in the past. And that's an example of a defensive routine in an organizational context whereby we have a very easy explanation of what went wrong. Whatever happened, it doesn't result in a fatal incident, therefore we don't need to worry about it. It would have been double loop learning to say, should we address more fundamentally why these foam strikes take place, and therefore is there the potential that they could lead to something more serious? Defensive routines also save time and avoid the embarrassment or the threat that might come with exposing one's thinking. And that comes back to mindset as well. If you're looking to avoid the embarrassment of processing something new, double loop style, and you believe that that might be a representation of the limits of your ability, and behind in the back of your mind, your ability is fixed, you can see how attitudes towards learning and things like defensive routines can actually become dangerous in certain environments. And they're encouraged by left column, right column dissociation. And the idea of left column, right column dissociation is simply about inputs and processes. So if a team, for example, is not operating on the basis that they recognize that the inputs to certain processes or decisions have a direct impact on the outcomes, then they are establishing defensive routines that don't accommodate for assessing the underpinning beliefs that go into decision making. I'm going to finish by looking at the concept of cognitive dissonance because it encapsulates some of these sorts of learning and defensive routine characteristics, and I'm going to demonstrate it to you through a sort of mini case study. A fascinating case study of cognitive dissonance in action, fixed mindset at a grand level. And we're talking about the UK's intervention in Iraq in the early 2000s, and particularly the British government's search for Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs. Tony Blair was the Prime Minister at the time, and we're in the recent aftermath of the September the 11th terror attacks in New York and the Pentagon. And in relation to that whole campaign, there was an agenda to oust the dictator Saddam Hussein, who was in power in Iraq. And Tony Blair, in an address to the House of Commons, was leveraging the suspicion that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction as a justification for a military campaign, boots on the ground in Iraq. And he said to the House of Commons in 2002, his WMD program is active, detailed, and growing. Now, when we're talking about the concept of cognitive dissonance, what we're talking about is an opportunity anybody has when something they believe is challenged. We've got two options basically. They can accept that they're wrong and look to learn from why they were wrong, or they can enter into denial. And when one enters into denial, there's the opportunity to start reinterpreting, re-rationalizing, reframing the evidence that they have before them to turn it in the favor of their beliefs, or indeed simply ignore it. And we're going to see what happened with Tony Blair's approach as we go through the following slides. So in September 2002, he had said his WMD program is active, detailed, and growing in a speech to the House of Commons. Now, the following year, soldiers went in to Iraq. They invaded, and they didn't find any weapons of mass destruction when they were occupying the territory. Then Saddam Hussein fell as dictator. He was ousted, and the government was able to send in the Iraq Survey Group, consisting of scientists and weapons experts. And in a further speech to the House of Commons in 2003, Tony Blair, Prime Minister, said, "I have no doubt that they will find the clearest possible evidence of Saddam's weapons of mass destruction." So the soldiers hadn't found them while they were invading the country, and it was now time for this group of weapons experts and scientists to see if they could find any evidence of the WMDs. That took us to the following year, 2004, and after this group of experts, the Iraq Survey Group, returned no findings whatsoever or any evidence that weapons of mass destruction had ever existed in Iraq, Tony Blair said this to the House of Commons: "We don't know what has happened to them. They could have been removed, they could have been hidden, they could have been destroyed." And what you're seeing Tony Blair doing is saying, I believe that they existed, I haven't found any evidence for them, therefore they must be really well hidden. That's the only explanation for the fact we can't find any weapons of mass destruction. Not that maybe they never existed in the first place, but his cognitive dissonance is forcing him to twist the evidence that's presented before him and force it into the hypothesis that he had made to begin with. So in 2005, he was making a speech to the Labour Party conference, and he said, "I can apologise for information that turned out to be wrong, but I can't, sincerely at least, apologise for removing Saddam." Now this is a further little bit of cognitive dissonance gymnastics, because it's post hoc rationalisation, or the ends justifying the means. So they had removed Saddam Hussein, and the justification for actually entering into Iraq in the first place was that we need to get rid of Saddam Hussein because he has weapons of mass destruction. Now, they have not established that there is any evidence to say that weapons of mass destruction ever existed in Iraq, but because Saddam Hussein has fallen and he was a bad guy, as the Western powers decided, Tony Blair is saying, well, look, we got the bad guy, so what's the problem? Does it matter that we never found weapons of mass destruction? Well, here's one of the unfortunate consequences of that approach. The backbone of what is now known as ISIS, the Islamic State group of Iraq and Syria, is now made of the officers of Saddam Hussein's Iraqi army, which was disbanded after the invasion by the coalition forces in 2003. So the justification for searching for weapons of mass destruction precipitated an invasion of a country that everybody acknowledged was under dictatorship but was stable. And the country was therefore completely destabilized and broken up, and a democratic government was not able to be successfully implemented in the years following the invasion. And the result of that was that Saddam Hussein's army, who was in control of the country, was full of people who had been important and had belonged to a cause, and were now they were displaced by the invasion and were looking for a cause to react to, and that led to the formation of ISIS, which has been the source of so many terror atrocities across Europe in recent years. So the unintended consequences of Tony Blair's cognitive dissonance were far-reaching and devastating for many people. So this idea of cognitive dissonance has relationships with concepts of fixed mindset and single loop learning, and you can see how the two compound one another to lead to situations where someone is having their beliefs or the assertions that they're making challenged and discredited, potentially by good evidence, and the very material nature, the very fabric of the evidence that's being presented to them, they are twisting to use as a form of illustrating that their initial assertions are definitely true. So to say, I think Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction, someone else comes back and says, there's no evidence that they exist. Tony Blair's response is, well, that means that they must be incredibly well hidden if not even you experts can find them. A really beautiful display of cognitive dissonance on a world stage that led to disastrous consequences. And that concludes our introduction to these elements of learning and mindset, and we will pick this up in class and have more discussion and exercises in relation to it. Thank you very much.